Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming on this absolutely glorious, gorgeous day. Some of you for the third time, some for the second time. You're going to get really tired of hearing me, but I promise not to go on very long. It's my pleasure, and this is the last of the, in our series of public lectures, to welcome you for the 2019 series of the Institute of Critical Social Inquiry's week-long intensive summer session. And for the few of you who haven't been here before, my name is Ann Stoller. I'm its founding director. I take it as a special privilege to welcome Nancy Fraser, a cherished colleague and a friend whose presence at the New School helped convince me that I needed to be here. And she convinced me why it mattered to be so. She was really persistent, got a lot of wine in me, many, many evenings. I said last night that I would not and did not need to list the numerous accolades of this year's extraordinary speakers and seminar leaders. I mean, for Etienne, I said, I'm not going to do that. Etienne Balibar was our first speaker. Achille Membe said, I'm not going to do it. And I don't need to do it at all for Nancy, but there is one accolade that I just have to mention because it's so cool. And it just happened a few months ago. And it's an honor that's pretty hard to ignore, given who Nancy is. She was named in October the Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur, a Knight of the Legion of Honor in France, the highest award and reward for what the nominating committee called her outstanding political and philosophical work. Now, we have to get this, right? This is not only an amazing award to receive, but more importantly, an amazing one to receive as a feminist scholar, as a critical theorist, when one is so irreverent toward contemporary gender hierarchies in France, so subversive of business as usual in the French and American Academy, and so prolific in her capacity to always remind her audience, and that's whether they want to hear it or not, that gender inequities are foundational to capitalism and threaded through it, and that it is our collective responsibility, all of us, to undo it, to undo them, no matter, and this is really important too, whether feminism is in high gear or in low ebb. And I think that's what's really striking also about Nancy Fraser's work. She doesn't abandon it when it's in low ebb and only stick with it when everybody is on the bandwagon. The last point is crucial because Nancy Fraser has consistently, persistently been a bulwark in her own right for making sure that feminism remains vibrantly self-critical, self-reflexive, and supple, enough to respond to ever new and renewed forms of discrimination and counter the multiple political forces that undermine it. She's garnered a stature. She just told me that this last book is translated in 20 languages, which I think is just the most extraordinary feat, fantastic, that defies disciplinary boundaries and parochial expertise with a clarity and a rigor hard to argue against. She has challenged politically correct positions and those people holding them, which is rarely ever an ad feminem or ad hominem attack. It's really on the principle of what a position looks like. But what's more striking is her capacity to find the enabling generative frame as she has in analyzing the relationship and the misconstrued antagonisms between a politics of recognition and redistribution, and she insists that she's always fought for the two. The places where she is found and seeks the mix of both, she keeps looking for those sites, and the danger she nails in not thinking hard about and acting upon the institutions and infrastructures that keep distribution off our collective political radars and allow identity politics, rather, to substitute for them. What Nancy Fraser does is make the conversation something that can be had. So she provides a frame to have that conversation doesn't reduce to a polemic. As she outlines, with always an acute sense of urgency, the consequences of not asking these questions and asking them better. Nancy has a way of teaching us about scales and common sense frames that she dissembles before our eyes so that they appear only afterwards, black marks, sore spots, clouding our vision once she has strained them through her analytic sieve. She has done that work for the politics of recognition, and not least in insisting that the Westphalian frame cannot come close to get at the scales of injustice with which we live. And I don't know about you, but I am one, I can't even hear the word Westphalian without thinking of Nancy. It's everywhere throughout her work. That really disabling Westphalian frame. She so powerfully has made that argument so ahead of the curve. And so ahead because she has her eyes. That's mine. Oh dear, that was like getting the days wrong in which people were speaking the other day, you know. Oh well. She has her eyes set on the distribution of inequalities and the mechanisms that sustain them. But she reminds us, in Capitalism, a conversation in critical theory, her book, the issue of redistribution, which I think a lot of people just sort of reduce what she's saying to that incorrectly, is not only economic. There is, as she writes, the problem of what counts as wealth in the first place and how that wealth is produced. It's so, so important. It's such a deeper, deeper level of analysis. And it is in the plethora of urgencies around employment, ecology, care deficits, and de-democratization that she asks the harder question. And I think this is kind of a question shared among all of us, Bachille, Etienne, myself, Nancy, about the connectivities that join these multiple sites of imminent or ongoing failure. There are few people who one thinks of as a paradigm of how the New School imagines itself, outspoken and heretical, and Nancy really is at the top of that list for a very good reason. There is her persistence to tackle the hard questions of our time and what we should be doing to confront them. She is nothing short of relentless. I think that's fair. In her vision for a feminism that can lead the way. In her last manifesto, Feminism for the 99%, which I'm sure most of you know about, that was just translated in 20 languages, written with Cinzia Ruza and Titi Bhattacharya, is a reminder that what she is after are strategies, I quote, for profound, far-reaching social transformation. That's kind of the bottom line for her, and nothing less. Meaning that feminist politics and scholarship can never and never should be a world apart. Join me in welcoming her to share her reflections on that battlefront now. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, I'm really glad that I was relentlessly persistent in getting you to come here. That's one thing that I've done that I'm really happy about, to the degree I played a role. Thank you so much, Anne, for the very generous introduction. Let me just see if I can get myself the way I want to be. And for inviting me to be part of this incredible institute, which I'm enjoying so much, and I'm finding the conversation, the 2 lectures we've already heard, the seminar discussions, really enlivening, and I feel like I'm taking away from this much, much more than I've actually myself contributed, so it's wonderful to be here. My title is a bit, I don't know, trepidatious, at least for me. What should socialism mean in the 21st century? A small question. Fortunately, it resonates and to some degree overlaps with things that Etienne has said and things that Achille has said. But I want to start from a specifically US phenomenon, and that's the surprising way in which socialism is back. For decades, this word was considered an embarrassment, a despised failure, a relic of a bygone era. No more. Today, politicians like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wear this label proudly, and they win support. Organizations like Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, attract new members in drove under that precise banner. But what exactly do they mean by socialism? However welcome, enthusiasm for the word does not translate automatically into serious reflection on its content. What exactly does or should socialism signify in the present era? Well, in this lecture, I'm going to provide some extremely sketchy and preliminary thoughts that do not add up to an answer, but may begin to sketch a path toward an answer. Drawing on an expanded conception of capitalism, I shall suggest that we need an expanded conception of socialism, one that overcomes the narrow economism of received understandings. Disclosing the capitalist economy's contradictory and destructive relations to its quote-unquote non-economic presuppositions, I shall contend that socialism must do more than only transform the realm of production. Over and above that desideratum, which I wholeheartedly endorse, socialism must also transform production's relations to its background conditions of possibility, namely to social reproduction, state power, non-human nature, and a variety of forms of wealth that lie outside capital's official circuits but are within its reach. In other words, as I'll explain, a socialism for our time must overcome not only capital's exploitation of wage labor, but also its free riding on unwaged care work, on public goods, and on wealth expropriated from racialized subjects and from non-human nature. The result, as I said, if we could get such a conception, would be an expanded conception of socialism. But expansion here does not mean mere addition. The point is not to add more features to received understandings while leaving the latter unchanged. It's rather to revise our views of both capitalism and socialism by incorporating into them structural accounts of matters that are usually considered secondary: gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, nationality, empire, ecology, and democracy. The result should, if it's successful, be to cast a new light on all the classical topoi of socialist thought, on the concepts of domination and emancipation, on class and crisis, on property, markets, and planning, on necessary labor, free time, and social surplus. Now, obviously, I won't be able to give anything close to even a sketchy account of all of those matters in this lecture. But I will have something to say, however preliminary, about three of these topoi, namely institutional boundaries, social surplus, and the role of markets. In each case, I'm going to try to show that and how the topic in question assumes a different guise once we view capitalism as something more than an economy, and once we view socialism as something more than an alternative economic system. The view of socialism that I hope will emerge from this exercise would differ sharply from Soviet-style communism on the one hand and from social democracy on the other. However, I have to begin with capitalism. In my view, this is the necessary starting point for any discussion of socialism. Socialism, after all, is no mere ought or utopian dream. If it's worth discussing now, it is rather because it encapsulates real, historically emergent possibilities, real societal potentials for human freedom, well-being, and happiness that capitalism itself has brought into being as potentials but cannot realize. Equally important, socialism is a response to capitalism's impasses and injustices, both to the problem the system generates non-accidentally and that it cannot solve, and to the structural domination and social divisions that are built into capitalist society. In other words, socialism claims to remedy capitalism's ills. And so it is there that we must begin, only by identifying capitalism's constitutive dynamics and institutional structures can we grasp exactly what it is that must be transformed. And only by proceeding on that basis can we envision the positive outlines of a socialist alternative. So my first question here is, what exactly is capitalism and what is wrong with it? All right, well, that's two questions, okay. First, often, capitalism is understood as an economic system whose defining components are private property and market exchange, wage labor and commodity production, credit and finance, profit, interest, and rent, all elements denominated in money and combined in such a way as to institutionalize economic growth as a system imperative. On this view, capitalism coincides with the range of activities, relations, and objects that are monetized, held to embody or produce economic value. I'm going to call this the narrow or restricted view of capitalism, held by most businessmen and businesswomen and most mainstream economists. It is also, I would say, the unreflective common sense of society at large. So much so that even many of capitalism's critics on the left tend unwittingly to subscribe to versions of this narrow view of it. That's the case of what I will call, following Moishe Postone, traditional Marxism. It views capitalism as a system of class exploitation centered on the relation between capitalists and workers at the point of production. The key relation is thought to be between those who own the means of production as their private property, on the one hand, and those who own nothing but their capacity to work and must therefore sell that peculiar commodity to a capitalist in order to live, on the other hand. This relation is crystallized in a market transaction in which labor power is exchanged for wages, but it is not an exchange of equivalence. I'm outlining now this traditional Marxist view. On the contrary, the capitalist pays only for the worker's socially necessary labor time, meaning the hours needed to produce a sum of value that equals the cost of the worker's subsistence or reproduction. Capitalist appropriates the rest of the worker's labor time as surplus value. So that's the meaning of the idea that this is a relationship of exploitation. Exploitation, on the narrow view of capitalism, is the very crux of the system. It is the secret of surplus value, the driver of technological innovation and of rising productivity, but also the source of poverty and class inequality, the motor of wholesale irrationality, of non-accidental bouts of mass unemployment and periodic outbreaks of economic crisis. Now, clearly, the traditional Marxian view of capitalism is a big improvement over the standard, let's say, mainstream bourgeois view, and yet it too remains overly narrow. This view focuses single-mindedly on what Marx called the hidden abode of production, while failing to interrogate the latter's conditions of possibility, production's conditions of possibility. These must be sought elsewhere, I claim, in other non-economic abodes that are more hidden still. While traditional Marxism captures the front story of capitalist society, so to speak, it glosses over the backstory, which makes it not so much wrong as incomplete. To complete the picture, and thereby to arrive at a full understanding of capitalist society, we need to go beyond not only the mainstream economic conception, but also the traditional Marxian alternative. Plumbing the more hidden depths beneath production, we need to disclose the non-economic conditions that make it possible. I'm going to mention briefly 4 such non-economic conditions for the possibility of a capitalist society, and you will see soon why it's important that socialism be constructed as an alternative to this whole enlarged order. Now, the first condition is a sizable fund of unwaged labor devoted to what feminists call social reproduction. This labor includes housework, the birthing and rearing of children, the care of adults, including waged workers, the elderly, and the unemployed. In effect, these are forms of people-making, which constitute an indispensable precondition for profit-making. Without them, there could be no workers, no labor power, no necessary or surplus labor time, no exploitation, no surplus value, no accumulation of capital, no profit. And yet, essential as they are, capital accords them no value, is totally unconcerned to replenish them, and seeks to avoid paying for them insofar as it can. There's also a second non-economic precondition for a capitalist economy, and that's a large fund of wealth expropriated from subjugated peoples, especially from racialized peoples. This wealth includes dependent, unfree, and unwaged or underwaged labor, but also expropriated land, looted mineral and energy deposits, human bodies and bodily organs, even children and reproductive capacities, all serving in one way or another throughout capitalism's history as inputs to capitalist production, for which capital pays little or nothing. Expropriated wealth was an indispensable source of capital's stockpiling at the start of the system's history, as Marx maintained in his discussion of primitive accumulation. But it did not cease with the system's maturation. On the contrary, the capitalist economy relies even now on a continuing stream of free or cheap inputs as a major source feeding into accumulation alongside and interimbricated with exploitation. Absent such expropriation of subject peoples, the exploitation of free workers would not be profitable. Yet, capital disavows its reliance on such wealth and refuses again to pay for its replenishment. A third non-economic precondition for a capitalist economy is a large fund of free gifts, that's a phrase Marx used, and or cheap, Jason Moore's phrase, inputs from non-human nature. These supply the indispensable material substratum of capitalist production, the raw materials that labor transforms, the energy that powers machines, and the foodstuffs that power bodies, hence arable land, breathable air, potable water, and of course, as we are now increasingly aware, the carbon-carrying capacities of the Earth's atmosphere. Absent these natural ecological conditions, there could be no economic producers or social reproducers, no wealth to expropriate or no free labor to exploit, no capital, no capitalists. Yet again, capital treats nature as a source of free or very cheap gifts to which it helps itself, but fails to replenish or repair. A fourth and final non-economic precondition for a capitalist economy is a large fund of public goods supplied by states and other public powers. These include legal orders that guarantee property rights, contracts, and free exchange, also repressive forces that ensure order, put down rebellions, manage dissent, and enable expropriation both within and beyond state territory. Also a money supply that stores value and enables transactions across broad swaths of time and space, transport and communications infrastructure, and a whole variety of mechanisms for managing system crises. Absent these public goods, there could be no social order, no trust, hence no exchange, no sustained accumulation. and yet capital tends to resent public power and seeks to evade the taxes that are necessary to sustain it and, in general, to weaken it in the immediate interest of its accumulation. Now, each of these four conditions represents, as I've said, an indispensable presupposition of a capitalist economy. Each harbors social relations, social activities, and forms of social wealth that together form the sine qua non of accumulation. Behind capitalism's official institutions, wage labor, production, exchange, finance, stand their necessary supports and enabling conditions: families, communities, nature, territorial states, political organizations, civil society, and not least of all, massive amounts and multiple forms of unwaged and expropriated labor. Fundamentally integral to capitalist society, these two are all constitutive elements of it. Capitalism, in other words, is no mere economy. It's something much larger. It's an institutionalized social order in which an arena of economized activities and relations is marked out and set apart from other non-economized zones on which the former depend, but which they disavow. A capitalist society, then, comprises an economy that is distinct from and dependent on a polity or political order, an arena of economic production that is distinct from and dependent on a zone of social reproduction, a set of relations of exploitation that is distinct from and dependent on background relations of expropriation, and a socio-historical realm of human activity that is held to be distinct from and dependent on what is envisioned as an ahistorical material substratum of non-human nature. So what I'm suggesting then is that we now leave behind the narrow view of capitalism as an economy. Conceiving it rather as an institutionalized social order, we arrive at an expanded view. This expanded view of capitalist society has major consequences, I believe, for the project of reimagining socialism. It changes, indeed enlarges our sense of what exactly is wrong with capitalism and what must be done to transform it. So now, let me take up that second question: what's wrong with capitalism? On the narrow view, there are three main wrongs built into capitalism, I would say, namely injustice, irrationality, and unfreedom. I want to say, I don't disagree with that, but I want to say a word about how each is interpreted within the narrow view. On the narrow view, as I already suggested, capitalism's core injustice consists in the exploitation by capital of the class of free propertyless workers, wage workers. The latter, as I said, work many hours for free, producing enormous wealth in which they have very little share. The benefits flow rather to the capitalist class, which appropriates their surplus labor and the surplus value generated by it, reinvesting the latter for that class's own purposes of further and ever-expanding accumulation. The larger consequence is the relentless, indeed exponential growth of capital as a hostile power that dominates the very workers who produce it. That is the core injustice on the narrow view, and it's already a pretty big one, let's face it. Namely, the class exploitation of wage labor at the point of production. This is a wrong whose locus is the capitalist economy, specifically the sphere of commodity or economic production. Now, on the narrow view, capitalism's chief irrationality is its built-in tendency to economic crisis. An economic system oriented to the limitless accumulation of surplus value, appropriated privately in the form of profit, is inherently self-destabilizing. The drive to increase profit by increasing productivity through technical advances results in periodic falls in the rate of profit, which may or may not be compensated for by counter tendencies in the overproduction of goods and in the overaccumulation of capital. Attempted fixes, like financialization, only postpone the day of reckoning while ensuring it will be all the more severe when it does finally arrive. In general, then, the course of capitalist development on this view is punctuated by periodic economic crises, by boom-bust cycles, stock market crashes, financial panics, bankruptcy chains, mass liquidations of value, and mass unemployment. This is all the narrow view, and believe me, there's a lot that's impressive about it. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. Finally, the narrow view entails that capitalism is deeply and constitutively undemocratic. Granted, it often promises democracy in the political realm, but that promise is systematically undercut by social inequality on the one hand and class power on the other. Then, too, the capitalist workplace is thoroughly exempt from any pretense of democratic self-governance. That's a sphere where capital commands and workers obey. On the narrow view, then, capitalism non-accidentally entrenches three chief wrongs. First, it lives by exploiting and dominating wage laborers. I'm summarizing here. Second, it's structurally primed to spawn periodic economic crises. And finally, it's constitutively non-democratic. Now, the trouble arises in each one of these cases from the inherent dynamics of capitalism's economy. Built into the DNA of that system, the wrongs of capitalism reside on the narrow view in its economic organization. Once again, I want to say that that picture is not so much wrong as incomplete. While correctly disclosing something about capitalism's inherent economic ills, it fails to register a range of non-economic injustices and crisis tendencies that are equally constitutive of and grounded in this mode of social organization. These come clearly into view when we adopt the expanded conception of capitalist society. So now I want to go through those three wrongs and show you how they look from the expanded perspective. First, the expanded view of capitalism discloses an expanded catalog of systemic injustices. Far from residing within its economy, these tend to be grounded rather in the divisions between the capitalist economy and its non-economic conditions of possibility. The division between economic production, where labor is remunerated in cash wages, and social reproduction, where it is often, although not always unwaged, sentimentalized, recompensed in love, that's a case in point. Historically gendered, this division entrenches a fundamental gender asymmetry at the heart of capitalist society. It grounds the subordination of women, gender binarism, and is closely connected, they're not identical, with heteronormativity. Similarly, capitalist societies institute a structural division between free workers who can exchange their labor power for the costs of their reproduction and dependent others whose persons and assets can simply be seized. Unable to access rights protections or the full costs of their own reproduction in the form of a wage, the latter group provides capital with a stream of free or cheap inputs that swell the tide of profit. The status division between the merely exploitable and the downright expropriable is fundamental to capitalist society, and it coincides roughly but unmistakably, in my view, with the global color line. It undergirds a range of structural injustices, including racial oppression, imperialisms both old and new, indigenous dispossession, and genocide. Then, too, capitalist societies institute a sharp division between human beings and non-human nature, which cease to belong to the same ontological universe. Reduced to a tap on the one hand and a sink on the other, non-human nature is open to brute extractivism and instrumentalization. Now, if we don't want to say, and I'm open to either possibility, that this is an injustice against nature or perhaps against non-human animals. It is at the very least an injustice against existing and future generations of human beings who are left with an increasingly uninhabitable planet. Finally, capitalism institutes a structural division between the economic and the political. On one side stands the private power of capital to organize production, using only the lash of hunger and need. On the other side stands the public power of the state, which is supposed to monopolize legitimate violence and represent or incarnate law. The effect of this division is to truncate the scope of the political, expelling from the public agenda a range of life and death questions, as I will shortly explain. Devolving those matters to capital, capitalist societies offer only a poor and shrunken facsimile of democracy, subjecting supposedly self-governing citizens to capital's arbitrary rule. These societies are veritable cauldrons of political injustice. So in general, an expanded view of capitalist society makes visible an expanded catalog of structural injustices, every bit as deep-seated and non-accidental as class exploitation. These injustices really are structural. A socialist alternative to capitalist society must remedy them too. Far from merely transforming the organization of economic production, it must also transform the latter's relation to social reproduction, and with it to the gender and the sexual orders. It must end capital's free riding on nature's free or cheap gifts and expropriation of the wealth of racialized populations. It must expand the scope of democratic self-rule beyond their current miserable limits. In sum, if socialism is to remedy capitalism's injustices, it must change not just the economy, but the entire institutionalized social order that is capitalist society. But if that sounds like a big job, it's not all. The expanded view of capitalism also enlarges our sense of what counts as a capitalist crisis. This is down to the irrationality problem. This view discloses some built-in self-destabilizing propensities above and beyond those internal to its economy. It discloses first a structural tendency to social reproductive crisis, insofar as capital tries to avoid paying for the unwaged care work on which it depends, and therefore periodically puts enormous pressure on the chief providers of that work, namely families, communities, and above all, women. The current financialized form of capitalist society is especially guilty on this point. It is generating just such a crisis today, as it demands simultaneously both retrenchment of public provision of social services and vastly increased hours of waged work per household and from women. That's a huge pincers movement on social reproduction. The expanded view also discloses an inherent tendency within capitalism to ecological crisis, insofar as capital works overtime to avoid paying anything close to the true replacement costs of the inputs it takes from non-human nature. Depleting the soil and befouling the seas, this system floods carbon sinks and overwhelms the carbon-carrying capacity of the planet, helping itself to all of those things while disavowing their repair and replacement costs. It periodically destabilizes the metabolic interaction between the human and non-human components of nature. I don't need to belabor here how acute is our present ecological crisis. Capitalism's tendency to ecological and social reproductive crises are inseparable from its constitutive reliance on expropriated wealth from racialized populations. Its reliance, as I said, on stolen lands, coerced labor, and looted minerals, on racialized zones as dumping grounds for toxic waste, and as suppliers of underpaid care work now increasingly organized in global care chains. The result is an intertwining of economic, ecological, and social crisis with racial, ethnic antagonism. Neoliberalism has clearly upped the ante here as well. Finally, the enlarged view of capitalism discloses a deep-seated tendency to political crisis. Here, too, capital tries to have it both ways, living off of public goods for which it tries not to pay, avoiding taxes to the degree it can, and scheming constantly to weaken state regulatory capacities. It tends to hollow out the very public powers on which it depends. The current financialized form of capitalism takes this game to a whole new level. Mega corporations outgun territorially tethered public powers, while global finance takes it upon itself to discipline states, making a mockery of elections, as in Greece, and preventing elected governments from addressing popular claims, even if some of them might have wanted to. Not all of them even want to, of course. The result is a major crisis of governance. The EU could be like the poster child for this, which is now reflected in an actual crisis of hegemony. That's political crisis at a different level, as masses of people across the globe defect from established political parties and established political common sense. So in general, the expanded view discloses that capitalism harbors multiple crisis tendencies above and beyond the economic. I understand these other crisis tendencies as premised on what I would call inter-realm contradictions. I'm really thinking kind of Polanyi here more than Marx. Contradictions that are lodged at the joints that separate and simultaneously connect the capitalist economy to its non-economic background conditions of possibility. In a nutshell, capital has a built-in tendency to erode or destroy or deplete, but in any case to destabilize its own conditions of possibility, which is to say, to eat its own tail. This too is part and parcel of what is wrong with capitalist society and of what socialism must overcome. Finally, the expanded view of capitalist society discloses an enlarged view of its democratic deficits. The problem is not only that economic inequality and class power thwart the possibility of equal democratic voice in the political realm, nor is it only that bosses command on the factory floor. Equally, if not more important, is the preemptive removal of the most consequential matters from the scope of democratic decision-making altogether. How should we organize the production of goods, of use values that satisfy our needs? On what energic basis and through what sorts of social relations? How should we relate the production of goods to the reproductions of persons on the one hand and to that of non-human nature on the other? And perhaps most important of all, how shall we dispose over the social surplus we collectively produce? In capitalist societies, we have virtually no say in these matters. Investors bent on maximal accumulation decide them behind our backs. In general, then, an expanded view of capitalist society discloses an expanded view of the system's ills. If socialism aims to remedy capitalism's wrongs, it faces a very big job. It must invent a new social order that overcomes not only, again in quotes, class domination, but also asymmetries of gender and sex, racial, ethnic, imperial oppressions, and political domination across the board. Then, two, it must deinstitutionalize multiple crisis tendencies, not just economic and financial, but also ecological, social, reproductive, and political. Finally, a socialism for the 21st century must vastly enlarge the purview of democracy to encompass not just decision-making within a predefined political zone, but more fundamentally, it must democratize the very process of definition and demarcation, the very frames that constitute the political. Now that brings me to the hard part. What then is socialism on this expanded view? Clearly, the project of rethinking socialism for the 21st century is itself a pretty big job, far too big for any single person or for even a single group of persons engaged in theorizing. If the job gets done at all, which I admit is a pretty big if, it will be through the combined efforts of activists and theorists as insights gained through social struggle synergize with programmatic thinking and with political organization. Nevertheless, I want to offer 3 sets of very brief reflections that seem to me to follow somehow from what I have already said, and these have to do with institutional boundaries, the question of the joints, with social surplus, and with the role of markets. Now I have to, at this point very soon, switch to my handwritten text that I didn't have time to type into the computer. I hope I can read these notes. I already dropped them. Okay, so first of all, boundary questions. Now I want to say that boundary questions, what I mean by that are the institutional divisions where the boundaries between the realms are drawn, by whom, in what form, and so on. Boundary questions, I think, are at least as important as questions about the internal organization of supposedly pre-given spheres, such as the economic and the political. Instead of focusing exclusively or one-sidedly on the organization of the economy or of production, as socialists have often tended to do, socialists in the 21st century need to think about the economy's relation to its background conditions of possibility. Again, to social reproduction, non-human nature, non-capitalized forms of wealth and public power. If socialism is to overcome institutionalized irrationality, domination, and unfreedom, it must reimagine the relations between production and reproduction, between society and nature, between the social and the political. Now, I do not think that it follows that socialism, let me get now to my other text, that socialism must aim to liquidate these divisions. So the Soviet attempt to abolish the polity-economy distinction can stand as a very powerful warning against any kind of brute liquidationist project here. But that doesn't prevent us from trying to re-envision these boundaries, which might mean relocating them, changing where they are drawn, softening them, rendering them more porous, and perhaps most important, reversing the direction of priority. In other words, taking what is now in the background as that is right, supporting the main thing, the production of value within the official economy, and putting them as the front story. In other words, elevate people-making or social reproduction and ecological sustainability and democratic self-rule over growth and efficiency imperatives as they now, to which they are now subordinated. Most important, I would say that socialism must think about what it could mean to democratize the very process of boundary setting and boundary division. That means democratizing what I think of as the metaphysical, how did I say that? Metapolitical, excuse me. Wow, the metapolitical task that some legal theorists call redomaining. Redomaining, that's a nice word. And that includes redomaining the spaces of first-order political participation. One thing involved here is that historically sedimented territorial political units, the states and nations that we know, they may not need to be completely abolished, but they certainly need to be resituated in relation to other let's call them functionally demarcated units based on what I've elsewhere called the all-subjected principle. Anybody subjected to a given power needs to be part of the demos that governs the exercise of that power. And these power relations don't all coincide with national territorial units. Many of them are quite transnational or global. So that's a kind of redomaining that I would say has to be guided by the principle of non-domination, including along all those major axes of domination entrenched in capitalist society, as well as any other axes of domination that we might not yet be aware of or that might emerge in the future. Equally important, such redomaining must be guided by the principle of no free riding, namely pay as you go. In effect, socialism has to institute sustainability as an effort, at the very least, to minimize crisis tendencies and irrationality. I'm going to say a bit more about that in just a minute. Oh, no, in fact, right now. A socialist society must undertake to replenish and replace all the wealth it uses up in production/reproduction. It must replenish care work, people-making work, just as it replenishes, as capitalism today, at least in theory, replenishes work that produces. No, I'm sorry, my text is so screwed up. Let me restate that. Socialism must replenish care work and people-making work, just as it must also replenish work that produces use values in the form of objects. It must replace all the work it takes from the quote-unquote outside, from nature, from peripheral societies, from populations who remain distant from and outside the official orbits of capital accumulation today. Socialism must replace all the political capacities and public goods it draws on in the course of meeting our other needs. In sum, the principle here is no free riding, no tail eating. And this proviso seems to me to be a sine qua non for overcoming those intergenerational injustices that are endemic to capitalism. We can't leave it off to our kids and grandkids and so on down the line. It's also, this is, I think, a principle that at least begins to let us think about what it would mean to overcome the multiple crisis tendencies that are built into capitalism. Okay, now I want to say a few words. I hope I still have another few minutes. I want to say a few words about the question of social surplus. I would say that in my view of socialism, this is the core: democratic control over social surplus. Surplus, after all, is whatever wealth our society generates in excess of what we require to reproduce the society at the given existing level at which we find ourselves. In capitalism, as we saw, surplus is treated as private property of the capitalist class or of individual capitalists and is invested by its owners as they see fit, generally with the aim to produce yet more surplus, and on without limit. This, I think, as I've already indicated, is both unjust and self-destabilizing. A socialist society, I want to say, must democratize control over social surplus. It must allocate surplus democratically, deciding collectively exactly what to do with the excess, as well as how much excess to produce in the first place, or indeed whether to produce any at all. We might want to just take it more easy and not worry about having such a huge surplus. In other words, although I'll qualify that in just a minute, in other words, socialism must treat all those questions I listed before as political questions. What and how much to produce, how many hours to devote to surplus production over and above work time that is needed to reproduce society at its current level, That is, how much free time versus how much work time, and as well as what projects, improvements, and so on we should invest our surplus labor time in. Now, as I said, surplus labor time means time left over after social reproduction, in the broad sense, the reproduction of the society, to meet our given social needs. It's time that could, in principle, be free time, although here we have to ask free for what? Now, in the early stages of socialism, I actually doubt that surplus time would loom very large. This is very different from Marx's view in the famous fragment on the machines. The reason has to do with the enormous unpaid bill that socialist society would inherit from capitalism. Although capitalism prides itself on its productivity, and although Marx himself thought it was a veritable engine for producing surplus, I have my doubts. The reason is that we tend conventionally to reckon surplus pretty much exclusively in the labor time that capital has taken from waged workers after they produced enough value sufficient to cover their own immediate costs of living. That, after all, you'll recall, is Marx's definition of surplus value. By contrast, I think Marx paid much less attention to those various free gifts and cheaps that capital expropriated or appropriated, and still less attention to its failure to cover their reproduction costs. What if we included those costs in our reckoning? What if capital had to pay for free reproductive work, for ecological repair and replenishment, for expropriated wealth of racialized, subjugated, and peripheral peoples, for the public goods it enjoys? How much surplus would capital really have produced? Now, that's a rhetorical question, because I myself wouldn't even begin to know how to go about arriving at an actual answer. Although maybe there are some feminists or environmental economists who have an idea about how to think about that one. In any case, what I'm saying is that a socialist society would inherit a very hefty bill for centuries of unpaid ecological reproduction costs and all those other categories of unpaid costs that I mentioned. It would also inherit, or maybe this is another way of saying the same thing, a very hefty bill for massive unmet basic human needs across the globe. Needs for healthcare, shelter, housing, transportation, education, food security, nutrition, environmentally sustainable conditions. These two don't count as surplus. These are necessities, absolute necessities. And the same holds for the pressing and enormous job of defossilizing the world economy. This is not optional, something you could decide, oh, we'll leave that, that's a surplus matter. Not optional. Shifting the entire basis of the economy to renewable energy. So this question of what is surplus and what is necessary leads me to some observations which concern my third topic, the role and character of markets in social. In other words, what I'm saying is that this expanded view recasts the whole problem of surplus, I think, in a fundamental way. And now I want to just say a word which also seems to me, I'm not sure, but seems to follow from this line of thought about the role of markets in a socialist society. And I will stop. I'm very close to the end. Let me just cut to the chase and state this in a very crude formula. Markets should have no place at the very top or at the very bottom, but they might have a role in the in-between. What I mean by the very top is what I've just been talking about, the allocation of social surplus. Assuming there is a social surplus to be allocated, it must be considered the collective wealth of the society as a whole. No private person or entity can own it or have the right to dispose of it. It's truly collective property to be allocated through a collective process of self-determination, which somehow, I don't have the vaguest idea how, has to be organized democratically. So market mechanisms for determining surplus allocation should have no role, zero at this level. That's the top. Now, the same holds, I claim, for what I'm calling the bottom, by which I mean the level of basic human needs: shelter, clothing, food, education, transport, healthcare, leisure, and so on and so forth. Now, I have no illusions that we or I could specify once and for all what exactly count as a basic need, what exactly is required to satisfy basic needs on a global scale. That too is a political question which somehow has to be subjected to democratic decision-making. But whatever is decided must be provided as a matter of right, not on the basis of ability to pay. And this is where I think that famous principle from each according to his or her ability to each according to his or her needs really applies. This rings true. This means that the use values we produce to meet these needs cannot be commodities. They must rather be public goods. No markets at the bottom, no markets in education, no private educational commodities, no markets in healthcare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, just as at the top. And I should say that this is why, incidentally, I am not a big fan of universal basic income, which tends to want to pay people cash to buy the stuff they need to meet their basic needs, and thus treats fundamental need satisfactions effectively as commodities. I'm saying that a socialist society must treat them rather as public goods. Now, if no private ownership or market exchange at the bottom and at the top, that leaves a huge amount of space in the middle, and I don't have a worked out view about that, but I'm open to experimentation. Anne is signaling that I should go faster, and since I don't really know what I want to say here anyway, I'm going to grab at her invitation to speed up. But this is the realm in which market socialism could make some sense. Where I'm going to conclude. All right, let me just conclude this way. I realize how very crude and rudimentary and preliminary this view, it's not even a real conception, but some elements of one, of socialism is that I have been sketching here. It's only the very, very barest beginning of only a few of the many important questions that have to, in the end, be answered. But I do hope that even this poor beginning might have some worth. I'm not going to say value. I hope specifically that it convinces you that the socialist project is worth considering and pursuing. But I also want to say that I hope I've shown you that socialism is not or can't remain as simply a buzzword. It's got to become the name for a genuine alternative to the system that is destroying the planet, the system that is mocking our capacities for living freely, democratically, and well. I hope, too, that I have convinced you that socialism, whatever it means, cannot today be broached in the old school way, only by starting with an expanded view of capitalism and of what is wrong with it, and by proceeding from there to expand our view of socialism, can we envision a conception of it that can speak to our full set of 21st century concerns and needs. If I've persuaded you of that and inspired you to want to do this project or pursue this project further, I will be satisfied. Thank you.
Queries, questions, comments, reactions are more than welcome. Please.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your talk. I found it so enlightening, and your work in general, highlighting the non-economic conditions of capitalism, I just find so illuminating. My question is that, given this new understanding of capitalism and socialism, and in light of these non-economic conditions of its existence, are there insights that you could offer on tactically the priorities of a socialist strategy, and in particular the question of which of these realms should we focus our energies? My intuition is that if it is capital that requires these non-economic conditions for its existence, should we focus on abolishing capital at its point of production, or is that the old way of thinking about it? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a really great question. It's an absolutely essential question, and without pretending to have anything remotely resembling a real persuasive answer, I would say that the focus on traditional labor exploitation, that can't be ignored, and there are places where that resistance and organization at that level are developing. It will be extremely important to see how labor struggle develops in China, for example, and we already have seen a whole set of interesting labor struggles that have to do with paid work in the sphere of social reproduction. I'm thinking of that massive wave of wildcat teacher strikes in the United States, the recent nurses' strike in New York City. It's here and not manufacturing that we are finding the sort of front lines of labor militancy in this country, at least. And what I've already said tells you that it's not a question of should we focus on labor exploitation or social reproduction. These are crossing and imbricated in some cases. And what is kind of interesting about some of the struggles I just mentioned is that they combine sort of traditional demands about wages, hours, and working conditions with demands for public goods, for state or public investment in what is needed to do the job that the workers are being asked to do. So limitations on class size for teachers. This historic win for the New York nurses, I think it's the first ever contract which puts a cap on patient load, how many patients they can be asked to care for and still be able to do their job. So here we're crossing, more than one thing. And in many places, ecological struggles are also very imbricated with social reproduction struggles. People are trying to defend a form of life that is implicated in a place and a habitat and so on and so forth. So I don't think we can neatly separate these realms, even if we wanted to. And I don't know that it's for theory to decide where to focus. I think people are deciding what is pressing for them and where they think they have a chance to, win some victories. And maybe the task of theory, but I don't want to just say theory, but of sort of all sort of reflective political imagination, whether it's in activist contexts or in the academy, the task would be to think about how the tremendous proliferation of social struggles around all the issues that I've mentioned might be connected up in order to have the breadth of vision and the social power to, actually make a social transformation of great magnitude. I think that's more the question about connection rather than choosing this versus that.
Before we go any further, I just want to say that before we leave this evening, I'd like to announce next year's 3 master classes. so don't run out in the middle.
Oh, I thought you were going to just do it.
Oh, well, I mean, I don't want to.
Okay. We're all on the edge of our seats.
Thank you very much for that talk. I have two questions. I just want to go back to your opening statement. You said socialism is back like in a big way in the United States. Do you see the United States taking a leading role in redefining socialism in the 21st century? And the second question has to do with the idea where you explained that to rethink socialism, we also have to rethink capitalism. And it just drew me back to the 1960s, to the African statesmen at that time, and how they critiqued the idea that you always have to think of socialism as something that arises out of the ills of capitalism. And in a way that sort of stops us thinking about ways in which we can think of an alternative without having to think of capitalism, but maybe, for instance, thinking about maybe ideas of communism. Okay. Okay, yeah, so I'm saying if you always have to think of socialism as a remedy to the ills of capitalism, then you're always thinking within this frame of capitalism, of exploitation, of labor and stuff like that. But if we think of it not as something arising out of capitalism, then we can think of it, for instance, we can go back maybe to ideas of community, for instance, of how do we share land or have freehold land, things like that. And in that way, we can think of something else and not be trapped in this language of money. And so do you see any room for this? I know their projects didn't quite work out, the Nyereres and the Nkrumahs, but do you see any room for their thought in your thinking to go back to the ideas they argued about, maybe communism, about an attitude of having this a communal sense of belonging, of sharing? Do you see any room for that in your thought?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, you raised two very good questions. I think the first one about do I see the U.S. as taking a leading role in rethinking socialism? I have no reason to assume that at all. I would say that if some massive socialist movement were to develop in the US, it would have world historical repercussions, since the US is basically the great Satan, and anything that, that reoriented it would be a huge opening for a lot of people elsewhere. But that doesn't mean I'm counting on that. No, I mean, I think that it's, I'd love to hear more from people from elsewhere about the connotations of this term socialism today. I think in Europe, in much of Europe, the term is trashed. It's just, the various socialist parties that consolidated neoliberalism. The last thing anyone probably wants to do is to call themselves a socialist. Maybe the UK Labour Party is a little different. But since we never haven't in many, many decades had a socialist party that's ever been anywhere close to power, the term here has a radical charge. And the fact that people are willing to self-describe in it, and with the exception of some Republicans, a lot of people don't seem to bat an eye. That's a really interesting moment for the U.S. It suggests that maybe the Cold War really is finally over. Although there's still plenty of Russophobia, that's for sure. The second question is a hard one, and I have a feeling that this might be very central in tomorrow's discussion. I know that the theme of the common in the community is central in Etienne's seminar, and that he'll have a lot to say about it, and I imagine Achille will as well. But I'm going to sort of take the provocation and register a skepticism that for me kept, that had to do with your use in posing the question several times about going back. It's that word back. We discussed this question actually a little bit in our own seminar about sort of motivations for struggle and resistance. In some cases, draw on experiences of either entitlement or social relationship that are of which there is memory or even past experience that function that people draw on as their sense of entitlement or whatever, and that's a sort of that sort of thing happens all the time, but it doesn't follow that those the memories, the traditions, the experiences or histories that are being drawn on are themselves fully adequate for what we need to think of today if we're really talking about some kind of planetary transformation here. If socialism was never possible in one country, but my God, today, how could we even imagine such a thing? So I think there are forms of coordination, very large-scale coordination, and yes, I would use a word that Etienne invoked, and planning, democratic planning, not, nomenclatura-dominated planning. I just think, I don't, but that shouldn't mean that's not an alternative to more local and face-to-face forms of community. But somehow we have to be able to integrate, forms of relationship at many different scales and different levels of concreteness, abstraction, and so on.
Nancy, I'm going to take, no, not at all. I'm going to take the liberty of playing devil's advocate. And as someone who was sort of raised on the social reproduction argument and wages for housework in London and people in the streets, and certainly on a colonial and imperial history in which all of these issues have basically been on the table for years. The notion that there's this, unfree labor, every form from slavery to indenture to convict labor, the carceral entire system. We didn't even mention carceral capitalism yet. These are things that we have known for so long and that we have imagined could be changed. I'm worried that there's a little bit of the, well, if everybody just understood capitalism to be about social reproduction too, then we'd be on the right track. Well, we've been saying that for some 50 years or more, that social reproduction, there is no capitalism without this articulation of modes of production. I mean, the whole thing's been all that anthropology and history has done in most of the rest of the world is to make that argument from Rosa Luxemburg, but way before that, right? So I'm kind of wondering if this is a bit utopian to say, well, if we only knew it. It's like, it worries me in the sense of, if we just tell the kids not to be racist, they won't be. If we change attitudes. Well, in the sense that, right, I don't mean to be facetious.
I'm really talking about structural change.
But you're talking about structural changes that I'm concerned have already been assaulted, attacked in so many ways that you've been part of and that I've been part of, So tell me why you feel, I think that really the key, and it seems to me to Etienne's talk and yours and to Achille's, is the connectivities of all these forms of crisis together.
Right.
That seems to be what's really, what you're setting out. That
Correct.
Not that if we get the social reproduction and we expand our notion of capital, that we'll be on the road.
So, I mean, Anne, you're absolutely right that a lot of what I have done has been to sort of take insights developed over decades by anti-imperialist and post-colonial theory, by feminist theory, by, well, in a more recent and very exciting development, by sort of eco-socialist, eco-feminist, eco-Marxist thinking in democratic theory, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's probably not one single idea in this talk that is just somehow totally invented out of thin air. I am weaving together a range of what I would call the general intellect. I mean, they're the sort of ideas of our time, the best ideas of our time. Now, why do I think that it's worth doing this now? This is a question about the now. And it's precisely because I believe could be proven wrong in the end, but I suspect we might well be in, at least at the beginning of one of these rare moments of general crisis that have maybe happened, 2 or 3 times in the past in the history of capitalist society, a moment where many strands of crisis converge: the economic, the financial, the ecological, the social, reproductive, the political. I mean, I think there is a widespread sense that the whole thing is broken, that we can't go on this way. And unfortunately, many people who are right in sensing that and who are actually, defecting from politics as usual, have very bad interpretations about what the real cause of the trouble is and what must be done, namely hardening the borders and all of that stuff to make sure that the Mexicans, the Muslims, et cetera, don't take our jobs and our stuff. So this is an attempt for now. I mean, granted, it's in an overly esoteric form, I guess, theoretical form, but maybe it could be translated. I mean, that's what the Feminist Manifesto for the 99%, that's a piece of agitational writing aimed at translating what would otherwise be a kind of esoteric, theoretical, political perspective for a broader public. And I think if people are talking about socialism now, at least in the United States, and calling themselves socialists, then maybe there are people who are interested in actually giving some real thought. Maybe DSA would be interested. It's attracting members in droves right now. So I'm trying to use whatever I've learned from all those decades and all that work that you've referenced, and whatever moves, let's say, intellectual moves I've developed, I'm trying to use them and put them at the service of whatever emancipatory forces might be out there listening at this moment.
Thank you. Great.
Hello. Thank you for speaking. In the beginning, you kind of touched on 3 tropes that apply to...
Can you speak into the mic?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Okay, yes. You talked about 3 tropes that kind of define how we think about capitalism: irrationality, unfreedom, and injustice. And in terms of irrationality, I'm wondering kind of who gets to define what's irrational, especially like even within democratic whatever. It's like in terms of gender issues, sexuality, race, that is also something that's been, an issue, especially within the democratic forum. So how do you kind of get to define what's rational, who gets to define that?
That's a really good question, and I have to say that I sort of threw that word in there in a sort of narrow sense, not to raise big questions, but I intended it in this very simple sense of crisis proneness, irrationality in the sense of a system that is constitutively primed to destroy its own conditions of possibility and therefore to stabilize itself. I meant only that, but there are plenty. I mean, if a system is constitutively prone to destroy the planet, I would call it irrational. Okay, maybe we could have an argument. Maybe there are some people, but and that's only a very small slice of what we might mean by irrationality. I guess in a somewhat technical sense of a self-undermining system, and I think that there are many other things that could be called irrational, but you'd have an argument. So you're right about that it's a matter for discussion rather than an a priori theoretical definition. Completely agree.
And Nancy, you actually answered it in another form. You said to democratize redomaining.
Right.
Right? And
right.
that's where
That's absolutely central here.
we're after 6,
Okay.
5 after 6, I guess. I know you asked a question yesterday, right?
2 days ago.
2 days ago. No, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure that if there was anyone else who hasn't gotten to, because this may be our last question. Anyone else?
It's a totally different question.
She's not going to ask the
Go
same
ahead.
question. That's great. Okay.
Because you were questioning how we're redefining socialism, and I thought that when I was a fierce activist, Marxist, I never called myself a socialist. There was a word, and I'm not uttering this word to be agitative or to be, rhetorical. It's called revolutionary.
Right, or maybe even communist. Yeah.
Well, we were not communist because Soviet Union was communist, so we were not communist.
Right.
But the whole idea of revolutionary actually says a lot in our revisiting of socialist tenets because, for example, every time we talk about care workers, why are we imagining a female?
No.
So revolution does not mean storming the White Palace.
Good.
It means we can go to Gramsci or to Engels, the trenches of life. So, the fact that, Bernie Sanders says that. He's trying to do what FDR tried to do. So, the aspect of revolutionary is not there, which connects to my second, this is a question, actually. Second question, which is, if we are going to, we will try to understand capitalism, somehow there's one element of capitalism that has been surviving since the days of any revolution we know of, that's consumerism, which we do not address. And as long as consumerism is around, every single labor movement we see around us is actually a movement where people want to buy more. So in that sense, in all these discussions of socialism, great analysis, I have no question about that. I don't see the element of revolution and not in the rhetorical form.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I don't object to the word revolutionary if what that means is not a kind of war of maneuver, as you say, storming the Winter Palace or whatever, but if it means that we're talking about deep structural change, that's a good enough sense of a revolution for me. As I say, the sort of hook of this particular bit of writing is just the re-emergence in US political discourse of the term socialism. So that's my hook. I'm saying, okay, let's figure out, if you want to call yourself that, then what does it mean, and so on and so forth. If the word revolutionary were being used, maybe I would have stressed that word. That's sort of the rhetorical thing. Consumerism, and in general, the grammar of life. Consumerism is obviously deeply connected with everything I talked about, right? The wage enables you to buy commodities. The split between social reproduction and production means that the home is a space of consumer commodity consumption. The weakness and pressures for public divestment in public goods is a new spur to consumerism. And the ecological impact of much of this is truly devastating. The other question, which I didn't raise at all, is that, I mean, we have to ask, does this really make us happy? To just be buying glitzy new stuff that turns out to be junk anyway once you have it for a while. I mean, there are questions about not just justice, irrationality, unfreedom, but the actual quality of life and whether it's satisfying, whether it is affectively, emotionally, psychically satisfying. And there's a lot to be said about consumerism there, because it's addictive and yet empty somehow.
Before we thank Nancy for a really incredible talk and for giving us some hope, I'd like to just let you know who the master classes will be taught by next year, in a continuation, I think, very much of some of these conversations. One of them will be E.L. Weissman, who works on architectural forensics, and an architect who is just an amazing, well, I don't need to say more about him. Saskia Sassen, who is going to be doing her seminar on expulsions. And last but not least, Noam Chomsky, who is going to probably, one of the last things that he's going to be doing, he was been very hesitant and felt he, wasn't sure he could do it, but he was really excited by this project. And I hope this will continue just the bar that's been set this year for just amazing, amazing conversations. So thank you all. And thank you, Nancy.